Here we're going to look at chapter 1 of your book, The Introduction, Psychology Yesterday and Today. We're going to look at the history of psychology from antiquity up until modern explorations of psychology as a science and as a therapy. So, we begin here with some nice pictures. The one on the left demonstrating sort of the psychologist of yesterday, of the 1800s. And then we look at the psychologist of today. Actually, that's probably in the 90s, to be fair, where we're looking at, that's actually a Skinner box that you can see recording the response cycles of rats. And we can use that to actually help predict the response cycles of humans. So what is psychology? How do we define psychology? We define psychology by looking at it as the scientific study of mental processes and behavior. Now, there are a few really key words with that definition. We have first that it is a scientific study. When we look at psychology, first and foremost, it is scientific. That means that we follow the scientific method from developing a hypothesis through developing a theory based on empirical evidence. And then we study both mental processes and behavior. Now, mental processes, we look at mental processes as anything that you do that can't be directly observed. Now, I can hook you up to an EEG machine, or I can put you in an MRI machine, and I can examine how your brain behaves when you think about things. But I can't actually examine what it is you're thinking about. You can tell me you're thinking about apples, but really you're thinking about oranges. There's no way for me to prove that that's a lie, except in the observable behaviors, not the mental processes, but the behaviors that would indicate that you are lying in that case. Okay? Psychology has 4 goals. Okay? We want to describe behavior first, right? So we want to be able to say, this is being done. This is a thing, right? If we want to examine your behavior in the hallway, then we will describe that behavior first. We will see what sort of groups people walk in. Do you walk in clusters? Do you walk in lines? Is it across the hallway or down the hallway? How many people are in an average group? How many individuals who are without a group walk down the hallway at any given time? So we will describe the behavior. And then we can begin, once we have an accurate description, we can begin to explain that behavior. We can give reasons why people behave in that way. Now, not all psychological studies are going to reach explanation, and that's okay. But many do, and we begin explaining that behavior. And once we have an accurate explanation of the behavior, we can begin to predict the behavior. We can examine how behaviors in the hallway that happen on Monday may affect behaviors that happen on Tuesday, and we can predict those behaviors. Okay? And then we can begin to, over time, with an accurate ability to predict, we can sometimes learn to control the behavior, and this is sort of the last step in psychology and in many sciences, is to learn to control a given behavior so that we can, often for therapeutic purposes. In psychology, it's usually for therapeutic purposes. Unlike, for instance, in physics, where learning to control the behavior might give us space flight or taller buildings. With psychology, we tend to use it for therapeutic purposes because controlling human behavior otherwise is reasonably unethical, although we do, for instance, use controlling human behavior, for instance, in advertising. All right. When we want to look at behaviors or mental processes, particularly in humans, we can look at it on 3 different levels. We can look at the brain itself. We can look at the neural activity, the actual way that your brain cells activate, move energy around, use oxygen, use sugar, the way that neurotransmitters and electricity are functioning in your brain. We can look at the person, right? We can examine the emotions that you're experiencing, the ideas and thoughts and behaviors that you're having and doing. So we can look at the person, and often looking at the person is a simple matter of observation or asking questions. And then we can look at the group as well, because you don't function solely as an individual, rather you function as a collective, as part of a larger group, and that group may be friends, family, your exterior culture, your global culture, your microcultures. We can break it down into a great number of different levels for different kinds of groups to examine how those groups affect you and affect the people around you. So you sort of have to pick when you're doing a scientific experiment, when you're doing a psychological experiment. You pick whether you're going to be looking at the brain, the person, or the group, or occasionally interaction between those. Right? There's a nice little graphic for you, so we can look at, for instance, trolling behavior on the internet. Okay, we can look at the brain, and we can look at how brain structure activity and cell activity actually differs from person to person and situation to situation. And what pattern of brain activation do these trolls experience as they seek to upset other people, particularly on the internet? What do they get out of it? Almost certainly it is a pleasure response that they receive from it. We can look at the person, right? How does the content of their mental processes, how do their beliefs affect and influence their behavior on the internet? Okay, what values do they hold? Do they have a limited capacity for empathy, or are they actually using the internet as a buffer for their empathy so that they don't have to feel emotion for someone that they don't perceive as real? Okay, and then we can look at the group, right? How their social and cultural environments develop that behavior. We can look at their sense of affiliation to group. We can look at decreased connectivity to the group at large. That ties in, of course, to that empathy buffer that I talked about before. So these things are all interactive, and they don't exist in isolation. Very, very little in psychology does actually act in isolation. So when we're looking at one of these, we do still have to be aware of its influence on the others. When we talk about psychology's roots, often we'll talk about psychology beginning in the 1800s when we began studying the human mind in a scientific fashion. However, the roots of psychology really go back all the way into antiquity. Now, psychology means the study of the mind. That's what the word literally means. But it has its roots in philosophy, which means the love of knowledge. And in ancient times, philosophers would pose questions about the world around them, about themselves, about humanity at large, and then use logic to answer those questions. The study of philosophy goes back even before the written word, as far as we can tell. However, our most famous philosophers were some of those that came about shortly after the written word was developed. In particular, one called Aristotle, who began looking at the need for empirical testing and observation, not just asking questions and attempting to answer, but actually being able to hold the thing you're asking about in your hand, to test it, to examine the results of experimental design in order to answer your questions accurately, not to just guess about what your questions might be. So he advocated empirical testing, empirical observation about the world around him. Shortly after Aristotle, a philosopher and physician known as Hippocrates, who actually wrote the Hippocratic Oath that doctors still take today, used direct observation to test theories of medicine. And Hippocrates was able to develop many rudimentary medicines using empirical observation to examine how medication, how different plants, how different behaviors affected his patients. Now, Hippocrates mostly was interested in physical ailments. However, at the time, physicians were famous for also treating diseases of the mind. Although at the time they didn't really consider them to be diseases of the mind, instead they considered them to be uh, demon infestations and such. So instead of trying to examine the mind directly, they would attempt to expel the demons. Hippocrates used a plant called hellebore, which could cause uncontrollable vomiting or diarrhea depending on the breed, in order to expel these demons from the bodies of his patients. The other practice he would use was trephining, which was actually to drill a hole through the skull of his patients. When he did this, the crazy usually did stop. Unfortunately, so did most of everything else. Trephining was essentially a very early lobotomy because it did damage the cerebral tissue beneath and caused the patient usually to stop doing anything. They were still alive, often they could still eat, but they couldn't make decisions. They couldn't, they would spend the rest of their lives uh, needing help for everything being cleaned up after because they were unable to function. And this seems really barbaric, but it was actually used up until the early 1900s and all over the world. So trephining is not something that we sort of abandon in antiquity, although it isn't done anymore. The early days of psychology as a science were begun by a man named Wilhelm Wundt. He was an Austrian who opened the very first psychology lab. His degree was in medicine, not in psychology. There were no degrees in psychology when Wundt went through university. Instead, he developed this very first psychology laboratory in 1879 and began to study a branch of psychology called voluntarism. And he wanted to study the consciousness through this method. And he began studying his patients, and he had them write things down, and he asked them questions and examined things and looked at all the ways that someone can be conscious of the world around them. And Wundt just phenomenally failed to explain consciousness. This massive failure, fortunately, was not the end of psychology. In fact, because of the nature of science, when we fail, we just find something that works a little bit better. And we did. We founded a new school called structuralism. The structuralism was attempting to identify all of the elements of consciousness, like building blocks, instead of trying to examine consciousness as a whole. Instead, structuralism broke it down in an attempt to discover what the pieces were. They actually had people who would sit down and they would ask them questions a little bit, but for the most part they were asking someone to practice introspection, to look into their own mind, to look into their own awareness of consciousness and describe it. And this was founded by Edward Titchener, who was actually one of Wundt's students, who came to America and founded the first psychology laboratory. Founded the first psychology laboratory here. And Titchener studied structuralism for years, and again, a phenomenal failure to examine consciousness. In fact, Titchener decided that it was impossible to break down consciousness into these key elements that would provide structuralism with the necessary components. One of Titchener's students, William James, founded the school of functionalism. And he said that consciousness is not a solid object that you can look at and examine and determine how it's shaped. And it's not something that you can take the building blocks of and build up into something that resembles human awareness. Instead, our mental processes are this fluid, flowing, constantly changing process. Not a thing, but a process and a method by which we become aware of the world around us. And he actually described the stream of consciousness instead of looking at fixed elements. This concept of the stream of consciousness is one of the first solid psychological concepts that still sticks with us in the current day. We still use that term in psychology and to a certain extent in drug culture to describe what's going on when we are aware of things. Okay? This stream of consciousness emphasizes the purpose of the mind. Right? Its function in adapting to the environment, not necessarily what it does, but how it does it. And William James actually wrote the very first psychology textbook out of Harvard Press called The Principles of Psychology, first published in 1890. It was published for an extremely long time. I actually think you can still get copies of The Principles of Psychology, although it has been edited and updated a lot over the last 100 years. So, James was extremely influential, but again, generally failed to be able to describe consciousness in any useful way. So, and because psychology is a science, we're always looking for the function of it. We're looking for it to be useful. We need it to be helpful. Otherwise, it's kind of useless. So functionalism, again, and just like its predecessors, function died out and was no longer useful. However, functionalism helped us generate a way of examining how we perceive the world called Gestalt psychology. And we actually will look more into Gestalt psychology when we go into sensation and perception. But Gestalt psychology says that consciousness cannot be broken down into small elements. Even the word Gestalt means entirety or whole form. It doesn't translate very well, which is why we use the word Gestalt. Okay. But it studied the orderly way in which humans perceive the world around us, and it gave us a set, this is an example here, of the different ways that we perceive the world around us. Now, none of these exist independently of one another. In fact, they exist so intermingled with one another that it's impossible to separate them except in theory. But we'll examine these, like I said, a lot more when we get to sensation and perception. But suffice to say, the Gestalt looks at how we focus on whole perceptual units. For instance, looking at your friend's face rather than looking at your friend's nose and mouth and eyes and then deciding that that is a face. Okay. We break the world down into our perceptual units. As we move into the 20th century, we begin to have more familiar forms of psychology. One of the first familiar forms of psychology was founded by a man named Sigmund Freud. There's a colorized picture of Mr., or actually Dr. Freud, who was a medical doctor and began practicing a process that he called psychoanalysis. And he believed that people's behaviors were based on deep unconscious desires that drove your decision-making process and made you, sort of forced you to make decisions. Right? That we wanted to resolve these unconscious conflicts, often childhood conflicts that develop from the time when we were very young. And we'll get a lot deeper into Freud when we get into personality psychology and when we get into developmental psychology. But for the most part, when we look at psychoanalysis, we're actually looking at a defunct branch of psychology. There are still people who practice psychoanalysis, but very few people practice Freudian psychoanalysis. Even his students adapted his method to the point that he almost didn't recognize it anymore. In a reaction against psychoanalysis, which had very little in the way of usefulness, we began to develop behavioral psychology. Behavioral psychology was founded on the principle that we should not be examining these mental processes. We should not be examining these things that we can't observe and therefore prove exist. Instead, we will observe only observable behaviors, external behaviors. And behaviorist psychology wanted to examine sort of our reaction to external stimuli and how that altered how we respond to the world around us. In a way, the first behaviorist was not a psychologist at all, but a biologist named Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist who was studying not behavioral psychology, but instead how dogs salivated to different foods. And his experiment messed up really, really badly when the dogs began salivating when they heard his lab assistant's feet walking down the hallway to give them food. Before the food had ever been presented, before they could smell the food, the dog already began salivating when it heard the sound of footsteps. So Pavlov began examining why these dogs were salivating even when they weren't presented with food, and began to describe what we now call classical conditioning, and we'll get more into that in coming chapters. John Watson solidified this classical conditioning, especially with experiments on humans, looking at experimenting with a human baby named, well, not named, but called Little Albert. He examined upsetting Little Albert when he came in contact with white mice, and we'll have more on that story later as well. B.F. Skinner broke away from this classical conditioning, and Skinner is sort of called the founder of behaviorist psychology because he began looking at what he referred to as operant or instrumental conditioning. Rather than having two paired stimuli, like, for instance, a bell and food that causes you to salivate, B.F. Skinner wanted to look at how you could be prompted to do more complex tasks by application of reward or punishment after you had behaved in that particular way. Okay. And again, we'll get a lot more into behavioral psychology here in coming chapters. But for now, behaviorist psychology was one of the biggest breakthroughs in psychology in the 20th century, and it's still one of the major schools of psychology and is still used in therapeutic practices. Humanistic psychology was developed rather later, when psychologists decided that we can't just examine these external behaviors. There's more going on here. There's free will. Humans have the freedom to choose. Humans have the freedom to be what we want to be. Humans can deliberately break our own operant conditioning. When we've been conditioned to behave in a particular way, we can choose not to behave that way. And that sort of observation led to the development of humanistic psychology. Right? Humanistic psychology stresses an individual's capacity for personal growth and the freedom to choose and positive qualities that you have. Okay? Humanistic psychology believes that your perception of the world is more important than the behavior that world influences. Carl Rogers actually developed humanistic psychology and developed client-centered therapy. Now, normally when you go into a counselor, not necessarily when you go into a clinician, but when you go to see a counselor, they're going to work with humanistic psychology with you. It's very common in counseling practice because it deals a lot with talk therapy and it deals a lot with your ability to make decisions. Abraham Maslow is very common for anyone who's worked in the education field knows a lot about Abraham Maslow, who gave us our hierarchy of needs from the physiological needs up to self-actualization as a way of looking at what sort of needs and desires we are pursuing when we behave in a particular way, and how those needs and desires may twist and distort our behavior and thought processes into unhealthy behaviors. Cognitive psychology grew up sort of at the same time as humanistic psychology, and it focused on the importance of these mental processes. Cognitive psychology sort of pulled away from behaviorist psychology because it wasn't. Cognitive psychology still recognized that our behaviors are important, but said that our behaviors were a result of the way we process information, the way we think about information, the way we solve problems is in some ways more important than simple conditioning. Um, Cognitive psychology has been bolstered by advances in computing research, by advances in neuroscience, and particularly in modern times, cognitive and behavioral psychology have very much merged into what we refer to as cognitive behavioral psychology, where we can use both elements, both the seen and unseen aspects of human behavior, in order to predict and control human behavior. Okay. Ulrich Neisser coined the term cognitive psychology in terms of information processing, and he did a lot of work with computers. He examined how computer memory and human memory work in very much the same ways. And again, we'll get a lot more into cognitive psychology and information processing in later chapters. Cultural psychology deals with how cultures differ from one another and how they influence the people within them. What cognitive processes are universal? What cognitive processes do all humans experience? Right? All humans experience happiness in the same way, for instance, but not necessarily as a result of the same things. This is both a cultural and an individualistic difference between people. What makes you happy will not necessarily make your neighbor happy. And then which processes are specific to different cultures? Why, for instance, do Westerners shake hands and Easterners bow? Why do Americans shake hands and Europeans hug? Right? Why are these cultural differences present in our world? What purpose did they serve? How did they develop? All of this is elements of cultural psychology. Here we can look at, this is one of the elements that cultural psychology looks at is human emotion and how it's similar all across the world, and the fact that we all use essentially the same facial expressions. Our facial expressions appear to be biological and inborn, not taught. Okay. And all of that comes out of our awareness of cultural psychology. So, we look at contemporary psychology. Now, contemporary psychology is not in and of itself a school of psychology, but contemporary psychology is one of those things that that spans across all schools of psychology and sort of governs psychology as a science as a whole. There are things that we all do. Okay? And that is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, and not necessarily even human mental processes, because we do study animals as well. Psychology is always theory-driven. Okay? We use theories to explain behaviors. Now, when we talk about a theory, when we talk about a theory on the street, when your next door neighbor or when your mom talks about theory, chances are they're talking about, well, I have this idea, and this is my idea on the thing. But when a psychologist talks about theory, they're talking about the culmination of years, even decades of research. They're talking about the best possible solution given the evidence that we have. Now, our theories are not perfect, and there's a reason we don't say scientific law anymore. There are no scientific laws. Right? One of the last scientific laws that we had was the theory of gravity. We now call it Newtonian gravity. And we thought that that was the law. That was how gravity worked. And that explained all of gravity. And then we discovered black holes. Newtonian theory doesn't work for black holes. It can't work for black holes. Instead, this Newtonian theory can only work on sort of a relativistic scale. It can only exist on our scale. Right? But at the scale of even stars or black holes, when you get into the extremely large or the extremely small, this Newtonian theory doesn't work anymore, and we had to develop a different theory. We recognize that our theories are never complete. Our theories, our scientific theories, are always subject to debate. They are always subject to revision, given appropriate evidence. You cannot simply say, oh, I don't agree with that scientific theory, so it's just a theory, I'm going to abandon it. That's not how it works. If you disagree with the theory, you have to develop evidence that shows us that that theory is inaccurate. And when you do that, you can win enormous prizes, lots of money for doing that. Absolutely do that, but you can't just abandon a theory just because you don't like it. Okay. Moving on, psychology is empirical. It is always based on research. Now, occasionally this isn't the case. Occasionally, you will find experimental, or not experimental, but theoretical papers published in psychology, particularly in, for instance, cultural psychology, in historical psychology. If we want to look back and examine the psychology of human evolution from Cro-Magnon through Neanderthal man, we can't go and look at Cro-Magnon humans and experiment with them. It's not possible. So we write theoretical papers. But we use as much empirical evidence as possible in order to develop these theoretical papers. Right? And they are subject to far more peer review and far more debate than empirically based research. Modern psychology is multi-level. We explain behaviors by using the brain, the individual, and by using social influences. These things are not independent of one another. They are all interlinked with one another. And then we also look at the context. Psychology is based on cultural context, and you can't separate cultural context completely from you can't separate psychology from the cultural context that surrounds it. It's simply not possible, because we are influenced so heavily by our cultural awareness of the world around us that we can't completely separate ourselves from it, neither as the researcher nor as the person doing research. And as a result, we want more minorities. We want more people from other cultures. We want immigrants in psychology because they bring new context to the table. And they allow us to examine things in ways that we have never examined them before. All right. There are three main branches of psychology, not schools of psychology, mind you, but branches. The first of these branches is clinical and counseling psychology. And most of the time when you think about a psychologist, you think about a clinical and counseling psychologist. And a lot of this is because of Dr. Freud, who began clinical and counseling psychology. When you go to a psychologist and you need to talk about your problems, you need to talk about depression, or you need family or relational therapy, you're going to a clinical or a counseling psychologist. Okay? And they're very common. We have a lot of clinical and counseling psychologists, and they are important. But they are not the only kinds of psychologists in the world. There are academic psychologists, like me. Academic psychologists work as professors and as researchers. We teach psychology. We learn more about psychology. We do experiments. We write papers. Right? We add to the body of knowledge. Now, that's not to say that clinical and counseling psychologists don't, because they absolutely do. But academic psychologists tend to be more oriented on that particular aspect of it. And then there are applied psychologists. Okay? School psychologists, marketing psychologists, research psychologists, we have industrial organizational psychologists, human resources psychologists. All of these apply psychological skills in academic research to real-life situations. in order to make industry and commercial practices more efficient and more effective, these psychologists work to develop our world in a way that's more efficient for us, right? Modern keyboards, not your QWERTY keyboard that you probably use most of the time, but modern keyboards like the Dvorak keyboard were actually developed by psychologists. So there are ergonomic psychologists as well that work on determining how instrument panels and layouts and keyboards function best for humans. Here we have a graph. This is a graph of the fields that psychologists go into. You can see that about 47% here is this clinical psychology. It's a huge block of psychology, and that's great. We need these clinical psychologists, but the problem is that this field is absolutely glutted. There are too many clinical psychologists, and we don't have room for these individuals. There's not enough people who are paying to go to these clinical psychologists, even though way more people need to go to these clinical psychologists. Probably everyone should see either a clinician or a counselor, who together make up more than 50% of psychologists. Okay. We have neuroscience here, about 9%. Those tend to be medical doctors. Those tend to be medical professionals who work in psychological fields. Some of these other fields, of course, take up individually far less space. Things like industrial organizational psychologists, like school psychologists that try and make schools better. Right. So we have a lot of different branches of psychology, and you shouldn't think that psychology is all about clinical psychology, because it's not. Here's a breakdown of how psychologists are often employed. You can see here about 28% in colleges and universities. That's huge, right? Colleges and universities hire more psychologists than anyone else for now. Human services and human resources is about 11%. Hospitals is about 14%, right? 12% of psychologists are self-employed. Now these 12% that are self-employed, that's your 47% clinical psychologists. So you can see the problem, like, right off the bat, right? There are way more clinical psychologists than there is space for clinical psychologists to exist. And then the government does hire quite a few psychologists as well. So psychology is changing. We want more diversity. Remember when I talked about context and cultural context within psychology? We want psychology to change. We want to have more different viewpoints. We want to have more hypotheses. We want to have more ways of looking at things. And thus growing diversity actually helps psychology an enormous amount. At one point, psychology was actually made fun of. It was mocked for being the study of white college-age men, and it was at the time. Now we're sort of mocked for being the study of the behavior and mental processes of college students, because we still do a lot of research on college students, because it's a very easy group to do research on. But we want to incorporate these cross-cultural and underrepresented perspectives. We want more people coming in from other cultures. We want more women in psychology. We want more minorities in psychology, because they offer new viewpoints. Right? We want to look at collectivist cultures. We want to look at individualistic cultures. We want to look at heavily patriarchal societies. We want to look at weakly patriarchal societies. We want to look at societies with very small populations. We want to look at secret societies. So we want to look at all of these different levels of diversity, and that requires a diverse research group. Fortunately, the diversity in psychology is growing. and is growing dramatically. We also have dramatic advances in technology, both in computers and brain imaging. Now, one of the biggest leaps ahead that psychology has had in recent years was the MRI machine, the ability to look at the human brain while it's working. But we've had advances even beyond that in recent years, when we can look at quantum imaging of how electromagnetic fields in the human brain change and adapt. Now we can look at the human brain at a level that we never imagined possible, and it's opening up new avenues for us, and being able to examine psychology in ways that we never anticipated. This is an incredibly fast-growing science. It's something that is always changing, always growing. So you shouldn't feel like everything's been done, because it absolutely has not. There is so much more to do in psychology. There are hundreds of years of research, even to catch up with chemistry and physics. We have an enormous amount of information to process, to discover. There's things that we don't even know, questions we don't know to ask yet, because the research hasn't been done. And that's sort of getting into these new schools of thought. When we look at cognitive neuroscience, when we look at positive psychology, where we're actually looking at what makes humans different, what makes humans happy. Why are some people happier than other people? What are they doing differently? What are the things that happy people do? Well, we don't know. We're finding that out using positive psychology. At one time, all psychology graduates were men. Many women earned their PhD in psychology, but never received it. Women, for instance, like Christine Ladd Franklin, never received the 3 degrees in psychology that she should have gotten. Because it was such a male-dominated field, she received those degrees posthumously after she died. So, we've come a long way from only men to now 2/3 of psychology graduates are women. Now, approaching half of all psychology graduates are minorities. And we encourage this. We need more of this. There have been so many dramatic advances in psychology that have been performed by minorities, by women, that we cannot sit back and ignore this and pretend like psychology can be a static field, because it cannot. Psychology is the driving force behind increased diversity in the workforce, behind increased diversity in scientific fields, in STEM fields. Psychology is one of the most liberal and advanced sciences that exist out there. So absolutely minorities, absolutely women, yes. We need more of this. We need more cultures to be part of our research base. So that is psychology from the very beginning up to sort of the modern day, and hopefully reaching forward into the future. I hope that you'll really enjoy this class and continue working. Thank you.